The air is thick with fear. The dense fog wraps around the trees like a shroud, muffling the sounds of the night. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sends shivers down the spine. The forest is alive with an unseen presence, a whispering that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Shadows dance in the flickering candlelight. The room is filled with an eerie glow, the kind that makes you question what lurks just beyond the reach of the light. The walls, adorned with ancient tapestries, seem to close in as if the very fabric of the room is alive and watching. It's the 18th century, and superstition reigns supreme. In the heart of Eastern Europe, small villages are isolated, cut off from the rest of the world by dense forests and rugged mountains. The villagers live in constant fear of the unknown, their lives governed by ancient beliefs and rituals. In Eastern Europe, whispers travel on the wind. The wind carries tales of terror, stories of creatures that roam the night. It howls through the trees, a mournful sound that chills the blood. The villagers huddle in their homes, listening to the wind and praying for dawn. Stories of the undead, creatures of the night. These are not mere legends but deeply held beliefs. The Nosferatu, the vampires, are said to rise from their graves to feed on the living. Their presence is felt in the chill of the night air, in the shadows that move just out of sight. They are the Nosferatu, the vampires, and their legend is about to become terrifyingly real. In the old graveyards where the fog clings to the ground like a ghostly veil, the dead do not rest easy. The villagers speak of strange occurrences, of graves that appear disturbed, of figures seen moving among the tombstones. The villagers believed in the supernatural, they carried talismans and charms to ward off evil, and they performed rituals to protect themselves from the creatures of the night. They gathered in the market square, sharing stories and warnings, their faces lit by the flickering light of torches. Every town had its own tales. In the dimly lit taverns over mugs of ale, the townspeople would recount the stories they had heard from their elders, each tale more terrifying than the last, each one a reminder of the dangers that lurked in the darkness, tales of creatures that could rise from the grave. The villagers spoke in hushed tones of the Nosferatu, of how they could transform into bats or wolves, of how they could mesmerize their victims with a single glance. These stories were not just for entertainment, they were warnings, passed down through generations. These were not stories for entertainment, they were warnings. The old, weathered books filled with illustrations of these creatures were treated with reverence. They were consulted in times of trouble, their pages filled with the knowledge of how to protect oneself from the undead. They were truths passed down through generations. The elders, with their weathered faces and knowing eyes, would gather the young around the fire and recount the tales of old. These stories were their heritage, their way of preparing the next generation for the dangers that lay in the shadows. Arnold Paole was a soldier. He came from the village of Medveda in Serbia. Life was harsh in those days, death was a constant companion. But no one knew that Arnold's death would spark a legend that would terrify a continent. Arnold fought in the Habsburg army. He saw the horrors of war firsthand. He witnessed death on a daily basis. Little did he know, his own death would be just the beginning. One day Arnold returned home. He told tales of a dark encounter. He had been in Greece. There he met a vampire. The vampire attacked him. Arnold managed to fight back, but the encounter left him changed. He was never the same. Soon after, tragedy struck. Arnold died. It was an accident, they said. But the villagers remembered his stories. They remembered the vampire. Fear began to creep in. Was this truly the end of Arnold Paole? Weeks passed after Arnold's burial. Then the whispers started. Villagers claimed to have seen him. He was walking the streets at night. He looked the same, but different. His skin was pale. His eyes glowed. People started dying. They died in their sleep, their bodies drained of blood. The villagers were terrified. They remembered Arnold's stories. They knew what this meant. Arnold Paole had become a vampire. Fear turned to panic. The villagers were desperate. They needed to stop the vampire. They called on the local authorities, but even they were afraid. The stories of Arnold Paole spread like wildfire. People whispered his name in terror. The authorities felt the pressure. They had to act. They decided to exhume Arnold's body. They had to know the truth. Was he really a vampire, or was something else at play? The fate of the village rested on their decision. Section 6 Vampires, Fact or Folklore. In those times, belief in vampires was common. People believed what they saw, what they heard, and what they saw and heard was terrifying. The stories were passed down through generations. They were warnings, cautionary tales, tales of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. Vampires were real in the minds of the people. They were a part of their world, a dark and dangerous part, and Arnold Paole was becoming the embodiment of their worst nightmares. Section 7. The Exhumation of Arnold Paole. Under the cover of darkness, they gathered. The night was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. The villagers moved with a sense of purpose, their faces set in grim determination. Each step they took was heavy with the weight of the task ahead. The officials, clad in their formal attire, tried to maintain an air of authority, but the fear in their eyes betrayed their true feelings. The lanterns they carried cast flickering shadows, adding to the sense of foreboding that hung in the air. The villagers, the authorities, a priest. They stood together, a motley group united by a common fear. The priest, dressed in his traditional robes, clutched his Bible tightly, his knuckles white with tension. He was their spiritual guide, their beacon of hope in this dark hour. The villagers looked to him for reassurance, for a sign that they were doing the right thing. The authorities, on the other hand, were there to ensure that order was maintained, that the exhumation was carried out according to the law, but even they could not hide their unease. They were there to exhume the body of Arnold Paole. The tension was palpable. Every shovel that dug into the earth seemed to echo in the stillness of the night. The villagers exchanged nervous glances, their faces etched with fear and anxiety. They had heard the stories, the whispers of what lay beneath the ground. Arnold Paole, a man who had once been one of their own, now a source of terror and dread. The officials tried to maintain their composure, but the strain was evident in their stiff postures and tight-lipped expressions. Fear hung heavy in the air. It was a tangible presence, wrapping around them like a shroud. The villagers could feel it in the pit of their stomachs, a gnawing dread that refused to be ignored. They had come to this place, this grave, because they believed that Arnold Paole was not truly at rest, that he had become something else, something unnatural. The fear was not just for themselves, but for their families, their loved ones. They prayed that this exhumation would bring an end to the nightmare that had plagued their village. They prayed for salvation, for deliverance from the nightmare. Their voices rose in unison, a desperate plea to the heavens. The words of the prayers were familiar, but tonight they carried a new urgency, a new desperation. The villagers clung to their faith, hoping that it would be enough to protect them from the darkness that threatened to consume them. They prayed for strength, for courage, for the will to see this through. They prayed for Arnold Paole, that his soul might find peace, and that he would no longer haunt their dreams. The priest led the prayers. His voice, though trembling, was steady. He was their anchor, their guide through this ordeal. He recited the sacred words with a fervor born of fear and faith. He prayed for the souls of the villagers, for their protection and salvation. He prayed for Arnold Paole, that his restless spirit might find peace. The villagers listened, their hearts heavy with fear and hope. They drew strength from the priest's words, from his unwavering faith. They believed that if they followed his lead, they would be safe. His voice trembled with fear. The priest was not immune to the terror that gripped the villagers. He too had heard the stories, the whispers of what lay beneath the ground. He too feared what they might find when they exhumed the body of Arnold Paole. But he knew that he had to be strong, for the sake of his flock. He clutched his Bible tightly, drawing strength from its familiar weight. He prayed silently, asking for the courage to see this through, for the strength to protect his people from the darkness that threatened to engulf them. He prayed for their souls, for forgiveness. He asked for mercy, for deliverance from the evil that had taken hold of their village. He prayed that Arnold Paole's soul might find peace, that he would no longer haunt their dreams. The villagers listened, their hearts heavy with fear and hope. They drew strength from the priest's words, from his unwavering faith. They believed that if they followed his lead, they would be safe. They prayed that this exhumation would bring an end to the nightmare that had plagued their village. For this was a task not to be taken lightly. The exhumation of Arnold Paole was a last resort, a desperate attempt to rid the village of the terror that had taken hold. The villagers knew that they were treading on dangerous ground, that they were disturbing the rest of the dead, but they believed that it was necessary. that it was the only way to bring peace to their village. They steeled themselves for the task ahead, their faces set in grim determination. They knew that they had to see this through, no matter the cost. They were about to disturb the rest of the dead. The shovels bit into the earth, each stroke bringing them closer to their goal. The villagers watched, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew that they were on the brink of something terrible, something that could change their lives forever, but they also knew that they had no choice. They had to see this through, for the sake of their village, for the sake of their loved ones. They prayed that they would find peace, that they would be able to put the nightmare of Arnold Paole to rest once and for all. Section 8. A Gruesome Discovery. In the quiet village of Meduena, nestled in the heart of 18th century Europe, a chilling discovery was about to unfold. The villagers, already on edge from a series of mysterious deaths, gathered around a weathered wooden coffin. The air was thick with tension and fear. As the coffin was lifted, a gasp escaped their lips. The villagers had been dreading this moment, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to see. The coffin creaked open, revealing a sight that would haunt their dreams. The body of Arnold Paole was not as they expected. It was not decomposed. Instead, it lay there, eerily preserved, as if he had just been placed in the coffin moments ago. The villagers exchanged horrified glances, their worst fears confirmed. His skin was still fresh. It had an unnatural, almost lifelike quality to it. The villagers could hardly believe their eyes. How could a man who had been dead for weeks look so alive? His hair and nails had grown. This was a sign, they knew, of something sinister. In death, hair and nails should not grow. Yet here they were, longer and more unkempt than they had ever been in life, and there was blood on his mouth, fresh, red blood. It was as if he had been feeding, even in death. The sight of it sent shivers down their spines. This was no ordinary corpse. Panic surged through the crowd. The villagers recoiled in fear, some crossing themselves, others whispering prayers. They had heard tales of the undead, but to see it with their own eyes was something else entirely. They had heard the stories. Stories of the dead rising from their graves, of vampires that fed on the living. These were tales told to frighten children, or so they had thought, but now, those stories seemed all too real. They had dismissed them as superstition. But here was proof. Arnold Paole, a man they had known in life, was now something else entirely. The evidence was undeniable. The villagers were faced with a terrifying reality. Arnold Paole was a vampire. The word hung in the air, heavy with dread. It was a word that carried with it centuries of fear and superstition. And now, it was a word that described their neighbor, their friend. He had returned from the grave. The villagers could scarcely believe it, but the evidence was right before their eyes. Arnold Paole had come back, and he was not the same man they had buried. And he was responsible for the deaths that had plagued their village. The mysterious deaths that had left the village in mourning now had an explanation. The villagers knew what they had to do. They had to stop Arnold Paole, once and for all. Section 9. The legend endures. The story of Arnold Paole became a sensation. It spread throughout Europe. People were horrified and fascinated. It fueled the belief in vampires. It solidified their place in folklore and legend. Even today, the tale of Arnold Paole continues to frighten. It is a reminder of the power of belief, and the darkness that can lurk in the hearts of the living and the dead. The legend of the vampire lives on.